What happens when world leaders look at crises not through history books or scientific warnings, but through real estate metrics and electoral gains? In today's episode, we tackle two critical arenas of global policy, one unfolding in the war-scarred corridors of Europe and the other beneath the threatened canopy of the Amazon rainforest. We're from Washington. U.S. President Donald Trump welcomed European leaders and Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky not to rally the defense of international law, but to pitch a peace deal based on prime territory valuations. Across the hemisphere, Latin America's rainforest nations gathered in Bogota with ambitious pledges, but left with little more than diplomatic fog. While deforestation surges and fossil fuel expansion continues, so can historical memory and environmental urgency still shape global policy, or are these being replaced by deal-making instincts and political convenience? I'm Morsi, and this is In Focus. In what would have once been hailed as a landmark summit of Western unity, the recent gatherings at the White House featuring Trump, Zelensky and key European leaders instead highlighted a transatlantic fracture. According to the Financial Times, the root of the disconnect is simple but devastating. Europe remembers history, while Trump seems to be immune to it. From the trauma of two world wars to the scars of Soviet domination, Europe's political DNA, shaped by the 20th century. Russia's resurgence under Vladimir Putin isn't just a security threat, it's a haunting echo. But to Trump, Ukraine is just valuable oceanfront land, and the war is a business deal waiting to be made. He rarely invokes history except when misinterpreting it, and instead frames global conflict in real estate terms, misjudging Putin's ambitions and insulting the victims. This segment explores what's really at stake, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe's long-held commitment to peace, sovereignty, and collective security. Joining us now from Washington is Peter Roth, a contributing editor at Newsweek. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Firstly, good to be with you.
Thank you. Let's start off by asking, how do you interpret Trump's handling of the latest summit? Was this truly a case of historical amnesia or just a deliberate diplomatic rebranding?
I think it's the beginning of the era of Trumplomacy. President Trump put himself out there on the global stage to negotiate, or at least open negotiations with President Putin about the war in Ukraine, and did it in such a way that he had the leaders of most of the rest of the industrialized world beating down his door, asking to be invited into the conversation. I think that's a tremendous coup for him in terms of his appearance as a leader on the global stage. They're not making jokes about him sitting at the kids' table at the G7 summit anymore.
Yes, that's very true, but is this a new form? Are you suggesting that basically Trump is inaugurating a new era in U.S. politics, I suppose?
I think he is, frankly. I think that people understand that he knows what's going on, that he's not ignorant, that he does have a strategy, that he does have a policy, that he is a skilled negotiator who has objectives, that he's not just some lightweight dilettante who managed to machinate his way into the Oval Office, that he's a serious person and he needs to be taken seriously. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with him.
Yes.
but he is a serious person, and he's got to be taken seriously, not just because he's president of the United States.
Okay, now the Financial Times argues that Europe is haunted by history, but Trump is fixated on deals. Do you see this contrast weakening the transatlantic alliance? Because Trump is all about business, basically.
No, I think what weakens the transatlantic alliance is the unreliability of many of our European partners who want to, and I think this is Trump's position, who want to live under the security of the U.S. military umbrella, which includes our nuclear capacity, but also our ability to keep the seas open, our ability to project force halfway around the world overnight, as was demonstrated in the successful strike to take out the Iranian nuclear capability. I am concerned that when push comes to shove, to use an overused phrase, pressure on Russia will be economic, and that the French, the Germans, the Brits will blink rather than go all the way to the wall with Trump on trying to deny the Russians hard currency, real goods, and to isolate them in the global marketplace. Yeah,
but Trump's language has been quite neutral, or at least that's what we've seen in media. What risks does this pose when it comes to the Ukraine crisis and international support for it, especially when he doesn't clearly name Russia as the aggressor, and we've seen some sort of relatively warm reception for Putin in Alaska?
I don't think that's the right. I don't think that's the right take at all. I think Trump sees Putin as the aggressor, but the answer is, what do you do about it? Do you treat him like trash when you're trying, when in fact he holds most all the cards? I mean, the Ukrainians have been brilliant in their particularly in their use of drones to attack Russian territory. But if Putin wanted to end this war by taking Ukraine, and he was not concerned about the costs that Russia would incur in the global marketplace, even temporarily, by doing so, and he just wanted to be ruthless and roll the tanks across the country, he could do so. He has chosen not to. And so there is a negotiation going on where, in fact, Trump and the other allies of Ukraine are not dealing from a position of strength. They are dealing from a position of weakness. They have the weaker hand. And so I don't think that you started that negotiation off by treating Putin other than the leader of a major military power that's in the middle of a significant global conflict.
Yes.
You don't, letting him ride in the presidential limousine, treating him to the trappings of that come with a state visit. I don't think that you insult him.
Yes, which kind of brings on the next point. I mean, obviously the Europeans, the Europeans obviously understand the full weight of Russia and Vladimir Putin, where Emmanuel Macron called Putin, quote, an ogre at the rates. Can Europe afford to keep depending on the US president who refuses to share the same views, or at least outright say he may believe this, but he's not showing this support, I suppose, to the idea when it comes to his European partners?
If they want to continue to rely on America to defend them and to divert money that ought to go into their defense budget into social welfare spending that allows left-wing governments to routinely get reelected in places like France, then they're going to have to at least be deferential to the way the United States wants to handle these issues. Look at what President Trump did with the Indians, who increased the amount of crude oil that they're buying from the Russians. He slapped heavy economic penalties on them because they are indirectly fueling Putin's war machine. Do you really expect that the French, the Germans, the British, the Dutch, the Norwegians, the Danes are going to go along with that kind of economic toughness against a trading partner like the Indians?
But that's also true aggressiveness.
Or another nation?
Wouldn't it just push nations like India towards the global south rather than dealing with these sanctions?
Okay, well, you have choices to make. And choice number one is you ignore the Russian incursion into Ukraine entirely and behave like business as usual. And that anybody trades with the Russians, anybody supports the Russians, it doesn't bother you a whit, and you don't slap sanctions on the Russians, and you don't slap sanctions on their trading partners who are fueling their war machine. Now, everybody says that's a bad thing to do. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is the full force of NATO into Ukraine against the Russians. That's something nobody wants because they think it leads to at least regional, if not global, thermonuclear war. So where are you left? You're left in the middle where it's a combination of support for Ukraine's ability to defend itself along with sanctions that cripple the Russian war machine. Now, if you're not going to go along with the sanctions, you cannot pretend to be serious about standing up for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Well, now Trump
because
has
that is the only tool left. That is the only tool the West has.
But sanctions haven't worked for the last 2 years, and Trump often has claimed in the past that he could end the war in 24 hours, which obviously wouldn't happen through sanctions. There must be some sort of resolution that happens other than sanctions if it's going to take 24 hours. Do you think there's actual evidence that he is capable of ending this war within 24 hours, or is this just rhetoric to get
I think he's capable of. I think he's capable of ending it in 24 hours. He just won't tell us which 24. Okay. I mean, this is Trumpian hyperbole, and we need to get, we need to understand that that he has a higher risk tolerance than a lot of politicians do, and so he is prone to making bold statements to advance his negotiating position. He doesn't want the Russians to know what he's thinking. He doesn't want Zelensky to know what he's thinking. For a long time, the perception in America has been that Zelensky wanted America to win the war for Ukraine on Ukraine's terms. That's not a tenable position. We are not going to send the sons and daughters of South Carolina and Iowa and Idaho to Kyiv.
But have they actually asked for American troops to enter into the Ukrainian war? They just want to be propped up, militarily through arms and funding.
We are not going to send U.S. troops to fight in Ukraine under this administration. Period. That would be the end of the Trump presidency. It would probably be the end of the Republican Party. Trump's not going to go there. He's not going to do that without some kind of amazing provocation that is in the category of a black swan. That it's so unlikely that we can't even predict what it might be.
Mm-hmm. Well, now
the only way.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no, please finish what you have to say there.
I was just say the only way to bring this to an end in any kind of way that I think everybody but the Russians would regard as acceptable is some kind of permanent settlement that unfortunately recognizes that Crimea is now Russian territory permanently, as is part, at least, of the Donbass region. That's where I think this
that's
ends.
The only viable solution.
Part of the reason that it ends there is because the West did not resist the incursion into Crimea as it should have. That the United States and the Brits did not honor the Budapest Agreement as they promised to. That's where the failure came. It's like the old joke about Churchill and the woman at the dinner party, and he offers her a lot of money to go to bed with him, and she says she probably will, and then he offers her very little, and she says, "What do you think I am?" And he says, "We've already established that. Now we're negotiating."
Yes.
Well, once we established that Putin could have Crimea, we were negotiating about the future of Ukraine.
Yes, which kind of brings on the next idea. Now you say, at least in the U.S.'s opinion, the only viable option is for the Ukrainians to give up territory. Now, what do you think the European response should be towards this? And also, should they start preparing for a future where the US may no longer be the anchor of NATO?
That's up to the Europeans, whether the U.S. is the anchor of NATO or not. Certainly under this president, if the French and the Germans and the Dutch and the Spanish and the Italians aren't spending the kind of money on NATO that they promised to spend, then and by the way, victory for Trump, they are, or at least they're moving in the right direction. I think NATO is always a transatlantic alliance. It is always anchored in North America. If NATO ceases to be important to Europe, then it ceases to be important to the United States. And you might see something else. I do think obviously NATO membership for Ukraine, which is provocative, is off the table, probably for the rest of my life, if not just period, in the current global alignment. I'm all for the idea of the Americans and the Brits and the French and the Germans and the Italians and the Poles guaranteeing Ukraine's security, its territorial integrity. But the Americans and the Brits and the Russians guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity 25 years ago in the Budapest Accord. And how did that work out? I mean, this idea of these security guarantees, that's the kind of thing that led to World War I.
Yes.
You know, where the alliances were triggered. And this gets to the FT's point about the European lessons in history. They understand that, you know, these entangling alliances, which Washington warned against in his farewell address to the nation in 1793. That's how far it goes back. Beware of these entangling alliances because it commits you to things that you may not want to do in the future. The best way is for the West to increase its level of economic integration with Ukraine. So it becomes, which is sort of like posting a big keep out sign to the Russians.
Yes, all right.
We have territory here. We have an investment here. You're asking for trouble.
All right, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment, but thank you, Peter Roth, for the analysis on the growing rift between America and the transatlantic diplomacy as well, and Europe's historically rounded worldviews. While history casts a long shadow over Europe, another type of legacy, ecological collapse, looms over South America. With COP30 on the horizon, rainforest nations are racing against time. But are summits enough when forests are burning? In Bogota, the leaders of Amazon basin nations gathered for another round of summits under the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization. But as foreign policy highlights, the results were tepid. While ambitious climate pledges were made, from calls to ban oil exploration to launching a $125 billion forest protection fund, deforestation is still rising in Colombia and Bolivia, and some countries like Brazil continue fossil-fueled expansion. This gathering was meant to preview a united front ahead of the COP30 in November. Instead, it exposed internal divisions, fake targets, and slow follow-through. While Brazil did reduce deforestation slightly, Colombia saw a 50% spike, and Bolivia reached record levels. ACTO's scientific data plan is still unrealized, and indigenous inclusion in decision-making remains largely symbolic, with Trump's tariffs pressuring Brazil and others to diversify trade. Environmental urgency is being pushed down the agenda. So where does that leave the Amazon and the world ahead of COP30? Joining us now from Washington is Ginger Chapman, a political analyst and lawyer. Thank you for joining us, Ginger.
Thank you for having me today, Rayham, and on this very, very important topic of COP30.
So how do you assess the overall outcome of the Amazon summit? Were there any actual meaningful breakthroughs in it?
Well, Rayham, one of the things we saw is that all of the participants, the Latin American countries, were going into COP30 with a great deal of hope and enthusiasm for a collective effort to protect their environment. Indeed, that was the theme of this year's COP30, strengthening protections for the environment. But what people are waking up to is this climate change is really the enemy of the environment for many reasons. And perhaps your viewers may recall in COP28 when Sultan Abu Jabbar made a statement very controversial. He said, first, there's no evidence that phasing out fossil fuels is going to help us reach this 1.5 centigrade degree cooling. Two, phasing out fossil fuels will result in no socioeconomic development for poor countries and poor populations. And he also said that the climate change is, he did not highly climate change. And because he pointed this out, he received a great deal of approbation and criticism. However, Sultan Abu Jabbar made excellent and very correct points. And one of the reasons that we see the COP30 meeting in Brazil has not had good results, in Bogota, has not had strong results, tepid results. That is because the rainforest is a giant prize. It's a resource for multinational corporations. They want the rainforest. And indeed, who else was at COP30? We saw giant corporations such as Google, Nestle, Shell Oil had representatives there. And that's because the biggest threat to the rainforest is not, as we like to say, Brazil, Colombia, South American countries deforesting their own rainforest. It's because these giant corporations go in and they take over the rights under the processes of the International Monetary Fund, Bank of International Settlements. Yes. These corporations trap these countries into a debt trap. And the money we loan them is not for their own betterment. It's not for sanitation, education, infrastructure projects that benefit the poor.
It's to extort these countries, basically, into giving up forests. Am I correct in saying this?
Yes, you are absolutely correct, Rayham. We use this language of wanting to protect the environment, and then we go in and we expropriate and exploit the resources that are there for our own economic benefit and trade. Yes. And we leave the people of the country poorer and less well off, even though their leaders may be getting a little bit of enrichment themselves. So this is climate change, and these COP mechanisms are a front for the continued exploitation of developing countries. And if I may make one more point, this is very important. The term fossil fuel, we should stop using the term fossil fuel. It is a propaganda term to confuse and muddy our thinking and prevent us from speaking clearly about the issues. We should say oil, gas, diesel, hydroelectric, because these are very important topics. They're critical to our well-being and our thriving, especially developing nations. Developing nations need cheap electricity, sanitation, schools. They do not need giant corporations to go in and weaken their environmental protections and undermine them in the form of COP30 participation.
Okay, now there's a proposed $125 billion forest fund, which sounds very promising, but do you think this is more of a PR campaign or a policy to, show people, as you said earlier, that, we care about the environment? especially with very few mechanisms put in place to how this fund's going to be used and how to stop the deforestation process.
Yes, you are correct. This is a PR move. This 125 billion in funds, we know how it's going to be used. The funds will appear to go to the country, and then that country, those countries will have to spend that money on American materials or Western projects, Western diktats that control how that money is spent. So that money never winds up alleviating the environmental problems that are plaguing these countries. That money winds up being spent to further exploit and impoverish the people, once again, all under the banner of climate change and helping the people that are the recipients of our largesse, when in reality it's a Trojan horse for continued mining, deforestation, pollution of the rivers. And once again, this shows how not just our money, but our language is commandeered and used for propaganda and PR purposes, because all of these trendy buzzwords such as preventing deforestation, really what we are doing is continuing to degrade the environment. If we substitute the word pollution for environmental degradation, or if we substitute the word pollution for climate change, then the problems and the solutions would become much clearer. Instead of saying climate change, we should say pollution. Instead of saying fossil fuels, we should call it by the correct name: oil, gasoline, liquid natural gas, because once again, as you point out, the climate change propaganda is a hoax. It is a way to further entrap developing nations into corporate exploitation for American and Western purposes.
As you've said, like, obviously this is all about business, but like, for instance, part of the business deals that are happening right now under the Trump administration is the aggressive tariffs. Do you think that this could possibly accelerate the deforestation by pushing other countries like Brazil to end up ramping up trade at any sort of environmental cost to keep up with these tariffs?
These tariffs are becoming a much larger international issue than Trump anticipated. And that's an excellent point, tying the tariffs into our supposed environmental protections. There is a risk, as we've seen, Brazil, our tariffs drove Brazil into the arms of China, much like our secondary tariffs on India are driving India into the arms of China. Our previous sanctions have driven Russia into the arms of China. So our tariffs have really caused BRICS and the global South and other countries to develop alternative trade arrangements, alternative trade products, and most importantly, alternative payment methods, which does weaken the dollar. It does disrupt American economic hegemony. And these tariffs, the risk of bringing China in is that China has fewer environmental protections than the United States. So we are leaving countries like Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, South America, either at the risk of being exploited by American corporations or at the risk of environmental degradation as they increase trade with China. Indeed, these South American countries, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, they have vast natural resources, and that is why they are the targets, because many countries and companies desire and lust after their rainforest and their lands, and left to the corporations, they will lose their rainforest and wind up with nothing but monocultures of palm oil, palm trees that are only used to supply Western commercial goods at their own detriment.
All right, thank you, Ginger Chapman, for unpacking the urgent and often overlooked complexity of environmental diplomacy in Latin America. From a war in Europe shaped by memory to a rainforest on the brink shaped by neglect, today's crises reveal a dangerous truth. Without leadership grounded in history and accountability, the future risks becoming unrecognizable. Stay tuned for more on In Focus, other episodes of In Focus. Thank you for watching.